Genshin Impact is a free-to-play open-world action-adventure RPG gacha game created and published by miHoYo, a Chinese game development studio who previously created other popular gachas like Honky, Simpact, the Third One, and Tears of the Me because I'm single. Though I was a relative latecomer to Genshin, only getting into it more than half a year after its launch in June of 2021, I've been playing pretty consistently ever since, and while I very unambiguously enjoy my time with the game, there are enough problematic elements to it that I find that I have a pretty hard time recommending others play the game. Genshin Impact is, financially speaking, a massive success, recouping its development costs in just a month after its launch, becoming, at time of recording, the most profitable gacha game available on the market today, and not for no reason. There are many aspects of the game that are unambiguously excellent, with the visual design of the world and the incredible soundtrack being two particular standouts. That said, the game is not without its controversies. Many have criticized it for its borderline predatory monetization system, its lack of a meaningful endgame, and its absolutely brutal time-gated grind for artifacts and upgrade materials. It's had no shortage of scandals as well, from its recent spats about censorship to its disastrous one-year anniversary celebration to whatever the fuck this shit is. The point is that there's a lot to discuss about Genshin, from its mechanics to its lore to its monetization to even the meta-narrative surrounding it. And I'm gonna ignore literally all of that and just talk about its storytelling because I want to. The story of Genshin Impact follows a traveler, either Aether or Lumine depending on the player's choice at the start of the game. Oh, and by the way, this video will contain spoilers for the story of Genshin Impact. I feel like that should have been kinda obvious, but for the record, here's your spoiler warning. On your way to another world, you and your sibling find yourself attacked by an unknown god who, applies a Greeble texture to the both of you or something. I don't really know what's going on here. You wake up 500 years after the fact, stripped of your powers with no idea where your sibling is, and have to set off on an adventure through the land of Teyvat to discover their fate. Now, while this is a pretty generic hook, it works very well within the context of a game like Genshin, and I think its simplicity is, to some extent, a strength. Genshin is an open-world exploration game, so rather than focus on the narrative of the traveler, it makes a lot of sense to place more narrative focus on the world itself, especially early on in the story when the world of Teyvat is new and unfamiliar to the player. Within this context, the intro here serves as a baseline motivation to begin exploring the world of Teyvat, unraveling its mysteries in a quest to meet all the Archons in the hopes of finding the god who attacked you and your sibling, and at this, it does its job more than adequately, justifying your exploration while being minimally distracting or confusing. So the narrative of Genshin, especially in its early parts, is carried largely by the narrative of the world itself, its history, its characters, its locations, etc, you get the point. And to its credit, there's no shortage of substance there. The world of Teyvat is pretty fleshed out with a long and compelling history, much of it wrapped up in a mystery that the traveler is tasked with unraveling, and its history is, as the traveler finds out, pretty inextricably linked with their quest to find their sibling. And I think this is an idea that could really work. It gives the player time to acclimate to and learn about the world of Teyvat without completely reducing the traveler and their story to a non-factor. In concept, at least. Unfortunately, when it comes to actually conveying this narrative to us, Genshin can kind of fall apart a little bit. And that's what I really want to talk about because, guys, I'll be honest, sometimes the storytelling in this game can be a little bit. So Genshin has a bit of a problem with setting up its narrative properly. Generally speaking, when you're writing a story, you want to give the audience a little bit of background on the characters and the relevant places and histories that are going to be involved in the story. This is a good way to engage your audience. Letting them understand and relate to your characters and the narrative they're in helps them both to immerse themselves and to emotionally invest. And also, it's just a good idea to let the audience, be able to know what's going on and follow your story. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying you have to literally telegraph every single move you're going to make in your story. On the contrary, if you give the audience too much, they already know exactly what's going to happen in advance, there will be no narrative tension, and the story will be boring, and that's bad. However, give the audience too little, don't properly set things up, and they won't know what's going on, the story is confusing, and that's also bad. And I noticed as I was playing through the game that there were a lot of times in the story where I found myself confused or completely fucking lost in the sauce, and I've noticed this problem becoming more and more endemic, especially to some of the more recent additions to the story. Even some of the best content in this game is marred with it. A good example of this is Zhongli's second story quest, the one where you fight azhdaha. Now, don't get me wrong, the concept for the story here is still rock solid, and as a boss, azhdaha is really cool. His music slaps, he slaps, and I think his addition is an overall unambiguously positive thing for Genshin. But within the narrative of Zhongli's story quest, azhdaha comes out of fucking nowhere. We're walking along, we've met Quindren who can talk to rocks or something, and he's being cryptic and weird, and we're chasing after some miners who are following some little girl, and then all of a sudden there's a giant fucking rock turtle. Who is this whore? And what's really interesting is that this didn't have to be a problem at all. There's a cutscene that explains who azhdaha is, what his relationship to Zhongli is, how he ended up trapped in a mountain, all of which is pertinent information that it would have been nice to know going into the climactic epic battle against him. Except we don't see that cutscene until after after we fight azhdaha. This means that the player spends a good chunk of the story, arguably the most important part of it in fact, being completely confused with no idea what's going on. The fight with azhdaha should have been the emotional climax of the narrative, but there's no way for the audience to feel that emotion because we don't know who this character is. Could you imagine the impact it would have had we gone into the fight with the knowledge of who azhdaha is, of what he meant to Zhongli, of how much of a tragedy this whole situation really is? And sure, you could say that giving us all of azhdaha's backstory and who he is before the fact would have made the story too predictable, and yeah, that's fair, but there are other places to draw narrative tension from. The character of Kunjun, for example, is a good mystery to distract us with. And anyway, they didn't have to give us like the whole thing beforehand, they could have just given us a little. Like I said earlier, it's a balance. And as written, we go into that fight not even knowing the name azhdaha, which is kinda bad. There's a reason most stories introduce their main antagonists before the final fight with the main antagonist. It speaks to so much of the wasted potential here. And it isn't the only part of the story with this problem either. That the Traveler was present for the events of 500 years ago and knew about the destruction of Conria is ripped out of fucking nowhere when Dainsleif appears. We never see hide nor hair of that in the story at all, nor the fact that the Traveler has apparently been researching Conria in the whole time we were traveling together. None of this is ever addressed or brought up until the exact moment it's relevant to our conversation with Dainsleif, and that's, you know, more than a little jarring. Inazuma's story is full of this too. The fact that the Raiden Shogun is actually a puppet is never really alluded to, except for the slight difference in her eyes and like 1 or 2 lines of dialogue in the hour-long story quest leading up to the first fight with her. The idea that the Shogun inside the plane of Euthymia and the Shogun on the outside world are different is never set up properly until Yaimiko shows up and just expects us to know it somehow. So Genshin's problem, insofar as I can tell anyway, is that they blow all the budget on the super big climactic cinematics or cool huge boss battles, and then they realize they forgot to spare any budget for anything leading up to the huge boss battle. They want all the payoff without having to do any of the setup, and the end result of this is a story that can be really hard to follow for the player. And this leads pretty neatly into our second problem, So to their credit, the writers at MiHoYo seem to have realized that their story can be kinda hard to follow. Unfortunately, in order to address this problem, rather than writing a story that's self-contained and easier to follow and properly setting up the characters and events that are going to happen in the story, their solution to this problem is to just add a bunch of long, boring expository dialogue after the fact that explains what the story actually is. Look, I don't want to be mean about this, there are some situations where this sort of blatant exposition is warranted and can work. The beginning of Genshin has no shortage of exposition, but I'd say this is forgiven by it being the beginning of the story. Like, I get it, it's not ideal, but we don't have the resources to make cutscenes for every little thing, just explicitly tell us a thing out loud, it's fine. I do think there are places where the exposition could have been a little more natural, but this is at the very least understandable. Like, I get it. There are even examples of Genshin doing expository dialogue quite well, like after the Osile attack when Zhongli is with Signora and Child and he explains what his plan was and that he's the Geo Archon. I think the dialogue works in this context because the Livre Archon quest was framed as a murder mystery. There's a reason why Sherlock sitting down with Watson and explaining the mystery to him at the end of every story is a staple. It works. Or, at the end of every Archon quest, you get an NPC there who the player can ask about other extraneous details about the story that they're interested in. I think these are great places to put these sorts of expositions, at the beginning and end of the story where they don't interfere too much with the pacing and they don't grind the tension of the story to a halt. The thing where they have the NPC exposit to the player at the end of the story is an especially good idea. They get to wrap up any loose ends they didn't really have time to expand on in the story, and the player gets to choose how much of it they want to engage with, including giving them the option to not engage with it at all. But there comes a point where a story is using expository dialogue as a crutch, and Genshin crosses that line several times. Like when the Traveler reveals that they have been researching Conria this whole time. At this point, we are 2 countries deep into the story of Genshin. There should have been plenty of time to organically establish that the Traveler knows about Conria and is researching it in his off time. There are already 2 quests that are entirely about books up to this point. You couldn't have modified them a little bit, included something about the Traveler looking for information on Conria? Because instead, what we get is the Traveler abruptly revealing that they have been researching Conria themselves in their off time for the entire period we've been traveling together, just off screen so the player never saw it. We are probably like 30 hours into the game at this point. Like, expository dialogue should be used to set things up for the narrative, or to tidy up a few loose ends after the narrative is over. It should not be the narrative. We should be able to see the narrative play out for ourselves, not be told about it secondhand. And beyond its general misuse, there's just way too much damn exposition in this game. There's a scene with Child near the end of the Livre Archon quest that exemplifies Genshin's tendency to boring expository dialogue, right after entering the Golden House when Child approaches the Traveler for a boss fight. To their credit, they do a pretty good job of building tension up to this scene. Something is clearly up at the gates to Liyue, what with the Fatui being locked down on. We already know Child is up to something. When we enter the Golden House, the guards are knocked out. It's all quiet and ominous. The Exuvia looms menacingly over the room. Child enters, he starts his villain monologue, and then immediately goes off on a tangent about his, like, fucking personality and motivations, and how he's cool and different from Signora or something. Okay, I'm maybe overstating things a little bit. It's honestly only like 3 lines of dialogue. It's not that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things. Still, it's emblematic of the problem enough that it is, at least, worth our time examining. In terms of location in the narrative, I think it's actually fine. Right before a boss fight isn't a terrible time for a bit of exposition. Like, a villain monologue is a thing, sure, but he should be monologuing about his evil plan or whatever, and not explaining the differences in personality between him and his coworker. So, Child's expository line here doesn't work that well. One, it's unrelated to the events going on in the story. It destroys all the momentum that had been building up to this point by shifting the narrative focus in an entirely different direction. And, like real-world momentum, narrative momentum is hard to build up again once you lose it. And two, it's completely unnecessary. We already know the difference between Signora and Child. Signora ganks us outside the church in Mondstadt with her goon squad and icy powers, whereas Child, who, for the record, could have easily just thrown his whale at us and been done with it, decides to walk right the fuck up to us and start trying to throw hands. We don't need slow, boring expository dialogue that re-explains the characters that have already been explained to us by the story itself. We could have easily pieced together everything we needed to know about these characters' personalities by just playing the fucking game, which I would love to be doing, except there's too much goddamn expository dialogue in the way. God fucking damn it. It's honestly a little shocking to me that things ended up this way. I mean, Genshin has had a lot of story up to this point, spanning 3 full multi-act chapters across 3 countries, and that's not even counting all the side content from World Quest and Story Quest and Hangout events and natural world building from Exploration. There are a lot of opportunities to establish things without using dialogue. It makes you kind of wonder, what were they even doing with all that time if they weren't setting up the plot of the story? So the elephant in the room here is that the reason that Genshin doesn't set up its plot is that it's too busy setting up its cool characters that they totally want you to summon on, preferably by spending money. Like, take that scene with Child in the Golden House. Why would the writers think to include a line that explicitly establishes Child's fun and quirky personality in the middle of what's supposed to be his villain monologue? Well, the answer is pretty simple once you think about it. They want the audience to know about Child's fun and quirky personality, so they'll spend money to summon him. And look, I get that Genshin is a business and that to make money, they have to sell you the characters and shit. That's fine, I guess, but they're pushing the characters to the point where it's affecting the overall quality of the story itself, which impacts the quality of the game. Like the Ligre Archon quest, it's no secret that the middle of the quest evolves into fetch questy nonsense for like an hour straight. Looking back, a lot of those fetch quests were basically just excuses to run into and get to know the characters of Ligre. Most of the middle parts were completely focused on establishing Zhongli's character and personality, and then once we get Zhongli's personality down pat, we just move on to a bunch of other characters, to Bubu Pharmacy to meet Qiqi and Baizhu, up to the Guizhong Ballista where we meet Keqing and learn about her disdain for the gods or whatever, up to meet Ningguang where we learn about she has a lot of money. We spent a solid hour of story time just doing a lot of unengaging back and forth running around in dialogue, meeting a bunch of characters assembly line style and barely advancing the plot at all. Which is strange because there's definitely a plot happening in the background there. We hear murmurings of it all around us. Child's clearly up to something, the Qixing are going around restricting things and acting strangely, Ningguang mentions avoiding being played by the Fatui. We don't really get to examine any of that stuff in too much detail because we're too busy helping Zhongli get some perfume and shit or something. Between the time we get the Adepti and the time we go to the Golden House to the Exuvia, the Traveler achieves nothing meaningful to the plot at all. All we've really done in the meantime is meet a bunch of people. And it is possible to set up characters in a plot simultaneously. This is one thing that I think the Mondstadt story got pretty right. The difference there is that the characters we meet are involved in the plot of the story and help propel the story forward. All the knights are working together to fend off Dvalin. Venti is obviously important to the story. Diluc also has a vested interest in defending the town from Dvalin, but separate from the knights, so when they get tied up with diplomatic pressure from the Fatui, he's still free to act on the side. We're still meeting characters, sure, but the focus here is on Mondstadt's plight, the plot of the story we're in. The characters aren't just thrown in here for the sake of meeting them, their introductions help move the plot forward. By contrast, Liira's story quest, I mean it's not bad by any means obviously, it makes a lot of sense to center so much of the plot around Zhongli and Child, but there's a lot of extraneous fluff around the edges that serves no purpose to the plot and exists just for the sake of establishing characters, like Qiqi and Baiju's part of the story. Their section of the story is cute and funny, but they aren't super relevant to the plot here, and I think our time might have been better spent focusing a bit more on the dead god of this country and the mystery of who murdered him. And the inclusion of so much fluff stifles what should have been some of the key parts of this story. Ningguang being part of the story makes sense, but the way she calls the Traveler to the Jade Chamber feels a bit inorganic and like it came out of nowhere. She basically just summons us to have a conversation with her that doesn't accomplish much plot-wise. It fills the Traveler in on some of the details they're missing out on, but she doesn't ask us to do anything for her. Yes, okay, she reveals that the Fatui are up to no good in the region, but one, we kind kind of already knew that, and 2, the Traveler doesn't exactly do anything with that information, we just go right back to helping Zhongli collect some flowers. So why did she call us up to her? Did that move the plot forward? Was it just to exposit a bit? Same with Keqing, as the Qixing with the most disdain for the gods, if there's any character who should be relevant to a story where the Qixing sees power over Li Yue and supplant the Adepti, it should be her. This is like her whole character arc. But she barely shows up at all. Besides the ending fight against Osayo, the only other place she shows up in is at the Guizhong Ballista to tell the Traveler how to get to the Jade Chamber, where she incidentally explicitly explains her character to the player. She's not here to advance the plot at all, she's just here to establish the character of Keqing. I don't really have a fun way to transition to the next section, so we're just gonna... Genshin's writers clearly aren't bad. When they can just focus on a single character or a single plotline or whatever, they tend to do pretty well for themselves. Most of the story quests where the writers have free reign to just focus on a single character in their plot are pretty good. Some of them are even great. And the underlying stories being told are genuinely interesting. It's only when they're trying to multitask, when they're being forced to ham-fistedly shove characters into a narrative that they kinda don't belong in just for the sake of introducing that character to the player, it falls apart, makes everything feel overly long and padded out. It's really just a shame. The visuals, the music, the cinematics, these things have clearly been given a lot of love and polish, and I just wish that MiHoYo would give the narrative writers the same sort of resources they've been affording the music and graphics team. The deep, immersive narrative of this story was supposed to be a part of what separated it from the rest of the gacha games out there, that this wasn't just another waifu collection simulator, that this was going to be a real, engaging story that players could enjoy. And the writers are clearly putting in a lot of effort here. If you take the time to read the Dark Souls-esque flavor text attached to all the items and shit in game, it's clear that a lot of time and effort was put into fleshing out the background of the world, that the history and mystery that the Traveler and their sibling have found themselves wrapped up in has been given no shortage of thought. The recent story quests surrounding Tsurumi Island and Akanomiya were pretty good, and they had a lot of good storytelling, but a lot of that same quality doesn't get translated over to the main storyline of the game because it's clear the creators are putting priority on pushing the characters over actually telling an interesting story. But this choice is generously interpreted misguided, and ungenerously interpreted greedy and short-sighted. They're trying to shortcut themselves into an emotional connection between the characters they've created and the player, but all they've actually accomplished is devaluing both the characters and the story and the world the characters are in. Wow, that's a real downer to end a YouTube video on.